there's baggage, there's history, there's existing ways of doing things, right? Sometimes, you might lose sight of a strategy because you're so focused on operations and whatnot. So I think innovation in that context can be very challenging. But it is, again, I think, when you're in that kind of situation, it is really, the first step is having a really clear sense of purpose, right? And a clear story around like, well, why do we want to try this? Because, it's not easy. It's very hard. And sometimes when I'm having these long nights and thinking about like, why am I doing this? You have to remember, someone needs to be that kind of torchbearer of saying like, this is why, and this is why it's important, and this is why I think you should think it's important as well.
Like, you have such a fascinating background. Let's start with, if it's okay, the spotlight on you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do, but also how you got here?
Definitely. It's so funny because like I just had an informational interview with a student that's interested in design work, and it always, like, when people ask me that question, I always have to really think, because sometimes you forget the origin stories, right? So currently I'm the chief strategy and innovation officer for a company called Avida, based in Toronto. So we're a retail experience company, and I basically run the innovation practice, which is out of our innovation lab called X Lab, where we kind of do explorations around sensory experience design, focusing on the built environment, the physical brick and mortar built environment, right?
Sure.
That's what I do now. Where I started, though, which is strange because I would have never envisioned me ending up where I am right now. And oftentimes I think about, like, what would my 20-year-old self say to me? Would he be proud of me, or would he be like, what the hell happened to you, dude? But like, yeah, as you mentioned, I started as an artist, like, and I would say that's how I really got interested in, I guess, what people call innovation today, mainly through kind of like trying to understand like how we human behavior, what it means to be human, and how we like find meaning in the world, right? So when I was an undergrad, I went to art school. I was doing printmaking. I was, really interested in surrealism at the time, and the surrealism's approach to exhibition making, and really thinking about it, like what matters the most to human beings, such as, maybe it's the unconscious or dream worlds, right? And maybe it's not rational things that actually matter the most, and maybe we should be diving deeply into irrational things, right? And that kind of like really sparked my imagination. Super fascinated by that. Then I realized, my dad probably wouldn't be happy if I went and pursued the life of an artist, because he was very scared that I was gonna end up, really poor and having nowhere to live. So for times I still chose to pursue it, but then afterwards, I went to grad school in Toronto. And I was, focusing my research around public exhibitions and museums and curatorial practice. So there's that kind of like, organic trajectory of like going from an art practitioner, an artist. I was really interested in art making, meaning making through like cultural production, to a grad program that was really more theoretical based, but looking more at a macro level of how cities and governments use creativity as innovation, right? As whether it's part of their kind of rebranding. Toronto at that time was really rebranding as a creative city.
Yep.
So I was like, this is like super interesting as well, right? Because at that scale, you're looking at how human interactions and human experiences come together as groups, right? As communities and as cities. And that was like super fascinating to me. And then after that, after grad school, I became a museum planner. And again, just kind of meandering along and trying to figure out like where I kind of fit in, but just always
talk about that intersection of like a community place, a community environment, but also like, a community of artists, thinkers, what history, et cetera, in one place, and, what matters to people. So that, like, I sense that theme there.
Yeah, definitely. I think like what I learned the most from, when you go through art school is like you're cultivating a very specific sensibility and a very sensitivity to things around you, right? You're taught to look at the world in a very different way, to focus on details, or to focus on the interstitials between experiences, or the things that are not spoken. A classic example within design and in visual arts is the negative space around what's before you, right?
Yeah.
So you're already taught, like formally trained to kind of look at things a little bit differently, right? And then through that, oftentimes the practice of an artist is a very individual practice, right? But when you're making things, you obviously are trying to convene an audience around your art making, right? Otherwise, like from my perspective, there's no real point if you're just going to make something and hide it away in your closet, right? So there's always this ongoing concern about the human condition, human experience, human existence, right? So then when you bring into like the public realm, where it's more public funded culture, such as museums, then suddenly you can't really wear the hat of just I'm an artist and what I'm making is primarily based on what expressing myself. It's cool if you get it as an audience or as a viewer, but that's not my priority, right? But suddenly when
Right.
you're shifting into this realm of the public culture realm of museum making, exhibition making, you're not. It's a complete opposite almost. You now have to really think about your audience, your visitors. Are you designing for them first? The communities that you're designing, that you're speaking for, right? Their stories that you're trying to unearth and share through exhibition making, right? Uh, Still, the ideas that you started as an artist and that sensitivity that you've cultivated definitely helps with that work. But now you got to really kind of tone down on your own potential ego, if you want to call it that, and really think about the user first, right? So for me, when I tell to friends that are like in UX or service design or innovation, when I tell them my background, I always like to sheepishly say that I have this background, but they're always like, that's super interesting. And one person was like, that's like the OG service design that you were doing. Right? And I
Yeah.
was like, you know what? That's like a really interesting way to frame it, because in a sense, it is really about that kind of journey and that mapping and building that story and that space around the user.
Well, okay. I mean, there are so many gems in there, but I want to pick up on something that you just said, right? Tone down on your ego, and think about the user first, right? And
Mm,
we get it when we're thinking about experiences. We'll come to your retail experiences in a second. You think about museum experiences, you
right.
think about artistic exhibitions, you think about anything that just makes common sense. But at the same time, if I step back and I'm like, what is the number one thing, the number one conversation that I have with startup founders trying to build something new, the number one conversation that I have with corporate innovators or agitators inside a large company who like see a vision for
Mm,
something big and are frustrated, they're having challenges to achieve it. The number one thing kind of boils down to let go of your ego, think about the users and follow what they're telling you, right? Like
mhm.
isn't that kind of the source well of effective innovation?
I mean, I think it is for sure. I think where it gets hard, the more I do this, the more I realize is that it is never black and white. It's never either or. Because I think you can also go too far to the end of like we only have to listen to our users. Everything has to come from the user. Whereas there's also a sloppiness that can also enter the frame when you think that way, right? Because then there's that doesn't really leave room for your individual mission or vision, right? Because at the end of the day, you also have to show people something, right? You have to inspire people, and you also, when you're trying to create a community, you also have to give people something to coalesce around, right? So
Yeah.
often that requires leadership and vision, but at the same time, though, it's you have to make the space for the community to shape what that is at the end of the day, right? And I think that's trying to find that tension and the right spot of when to act upon that is the hard part, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to balance kind of the chaotic, emergent mutations that may result in something magic with a community
Yeah.
space, listening to your users, and to be fair, leadership. So let's talk about that leadership. How does your role at Avida how does that help shape the way that the organization thinks about innovation as you're serving your partners, your clients, et cetera? Can you tell me a little bit more about what innovation leadership means?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think about constantly because I don't know that I've cracked that egg yet. It's challenging. I think, as I kind of alluded to, it is really around working with the strategy of the company and really understanding why a company wants to innovate and what does innovation mean to that company itself. I think if you haven't done a good enough job of really thinking that through, then it's hard to, to be an effective leader, because at the end of the day, you have to kind of make it make sense for the culture of the place that you're you're kind of like working within, right? So sometimes when I look at startups that are pure startups that you know just had was came up from the ground up and just built something based on a really great idea and just existed for a couple of years, sometimes I get jealous. I know it's messy as hell and I know it's challenging as hell for sure,
Yeah.
but then in the one sense you don't have like a lot of I don't want to use the term baggage because that doesn't sound great, but that's the fact, right? Is you have
Baggage, man.
there's baggage, there's
Yeah.
history, there's existing ways of doing things, right? Sometimes, you might lose sight of a strategy because you're focused on operations and whatnot. So I think innovation in that context can be very challenging. But it is, again, I think, when you're in that kind of situation, it is really the first step is having a really clear sense of purpose, right? and a clear story around like, well, why do we want to try this? Because, it's not easy. It's very hard. And sometimes when I'm having these long nights and thinking about like, why am I doing this? You have to remember, or someone needs to be that kind of torchbearer of saying like, this is why, and this is why it's important, and this is why I think you should think it's important as well.